Thank you, everyone, and welcome to kind of our kickoff event for Earthstock. I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Dino Martins. He has been associated with Stony Brook University for over a decade. As a doctoral fellow with the Turkana Basin Institute, he was able to start some of the research and collaborations that we're going to learn about in the lecture tonight. And he has taught for every Stony Brook TB Origins Field School since the program began, and it has run 19 times at this point. Now, currently, Dr. Martins is the director of the Turkana Basin Institute. He has research appointments with ecology and evolutionary biology, as well as the School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences here at Stony Brook. He holds a PhD from Harvard University and a BA in anthropology with distinction from Indiana University. As not only an entomologist and evolutionary biologist, he's also an artist, a naturalist, and a writer. Dr. Martins seeks to share the wonders and diversity of nature, especially the hidden, beautiful details intrinsic to human life. Teaching people to see, understand, and care about the details of the living world is central to his research and writing. Communicating science and celebrating biodiversity is one of Dr. Martins' passions, and he has authored several works. His latest natural history book, The Grasses of East Africa, has been received with wide acclaim and highlights the beauty, diversity, and essential nature of this important group of plants. Currently, he is working on a natural history field guide to the bees of East Africa, as well as 2 nonfiction books on nature. Amongst many of the awards that he has received includes the Ashford Fellowship in the Natural Sciences from Harvard University, as well as being in 2002 and 2003, the Peter Jenkins Award for Excellence in African Environmental Journalism. And in 2011, he was named one of National Geographic's Emerging Explorers. Furthermore, he was elected as a Fellow of the Linnean Society of London and an honorary member of the Kenya Horticultural Society. More recently, in 2015, he was awarded the Whitley Gold Award for Conservation. This is a grassroots global conservation prize, and he was awarded it for improving the conservation and understanding of insects across East Africa. So it is with great pleasure that I would like to introduce Dr. Dino Martins. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Many thanks to Anil and to Tara for that introduction. So this evening, we're going to go on a little journey, a little safari across East Africa. We're going to be going back and forth in time and across these landscapes. And we're also going to visit a few other countries around the world. But basically, what we're going to do is to learn about some of the things that are most overlooked and most ignored. But actually, I hope you'll understand and connect with after this talk are some of the most interesting things in terms of how they contribute to our well-being and our survival. But also at this moment in time in particular, we should draw a lot of hope from some of these examples of how species interact, examples of how communities use knowledge about biodiversity, but also the overarching theme through this will be how little we still know, how much we need to know, and also how much we should be hopeful about in terms of what's happening. This photograph here, many biologists will recognize that this is an orchid, and this is a hawk moth, and that's actually its tongue. It took me about a decade to take this photo, even though I had seen this interaction happen. And it wasn't until I took the photograph that the other scientists believed me that this was happening, because this was something that had been sort of almost a myth in biology about the interaction between these 2 species. And in a moment, I will show you a slide about it. But to start today, I want to highlight that these are very, very challenging times, and they're also very hopeful times. If we think about the planet, and tomorrow is Earth Day, this continent of Africa and Madagascar, which is part of the continent of Africa, where I'm from, is a part of the world where we really do live in the best of times. We also live in a very challenging time. Africa faces the brunt of a huge amount of the impacts of climate change, of climate instability. In the last decade alone, we have had 4 major droughts in the country where I come from, in Kenya. And while we've had those droughts, in northern Kenya, in Turkana, the Lake Turkana, has been flooding. So in the midst of droughts, you have a lake that's flooding, and not just flooding, it has grown in surface area by over 1,000 square kilometers to over 8,000 square kilometers surface area of water in one of the hottest and driest parts of the world. So there are so many good things happening right now, if we think as scientists and young scientists, where we can use technology to understand the world, we can share information at a scale that is unprecedented, but those are also some of the challenges we face. How can we use this knowledge and use this information to really address some of the problems and the challenges in the world? And many of the students that I work with and have the pleasure of working with here at Stony Brook, that is one of the big questions they ask me is, what is there to be hopeful about? And I will hopefully make the case today that there is actually a fair bit to be hopeful about. I'm going to start with this because it is Easter Monday, and this is Noli Me Tangere. It's a painting by Bruegel the Younger, and there is Mary Magdalene, and obviously there is, Christ risen from the dead in the Garden of the Resurrection. And this painting, I think, captures, both at that time and now, some really interesting things that I'm going to highlight in this and another painting in a minute. So first of all, what Bruegel captured was this incredibly detailed observation of nature. So we all know who Mary Magdalene was. She was sometimes called a woman of poor reputation, but she then, met Jesus, and on this particular day, around this time, what happened is she was the first to greet Jesus after he came out of the tomb. And she mistook him for the gardener. That is why it is depicted as being in the garden of the resurrection. And she called out to him because she had met the angels previously who had delivered the message to her that Christ was risen. And so she was in the garden, and you can see all these plants. We'll talk about them in a minute. But she calls out to him as the gardener and says, Rabboni, which means teacher. And he speaks to her, and she immediately realizes that actually, no, it's not the gardener, and actually, it is actually the Christ who's risen. If we look at the plants in this picture, we can see there are several vegetables. You've got some turnips, parsnips, various members of the brassica family. You have also flowers, the lilies, the tulips, the forget-me-nots, all depicted, the roses up here, the climbing rose, depicted in great detail. You can recognize the species that are painted. And so, 400 years ago, the tradition of art, and much of the tradition of art for thousands of years, has been about depicting nature and depicting animals and depicting the things that, we see as beautiful and interesting. Here is another painting made at the same time, and this is very interesting because the first paintings made of Mary Magdalene in the Garden of the Resurrection, meeting Jesus, was very successful, and so the artists of the time, Rubens and Bruegel, collaborate, which today we would not think of as very much. We tend to think of a painting or work of art as very much produced by one artist. But at this time, they set up a studio, and what happens is Rubens paints the people, because he's really good at painting people, and Bruegel paints the landscape and the plants, because he's really good at painting those things. Notice here, there's things have sort of crept into this painting, and it's really amazing. First of all, let's look at the plants. We can see sort of more diversity here, the artichokes, which are also very symbolic of, resurrection and coming back to life, the tulips blooming as well, in this case in the pot. You've got these interesting fruits here, various melons and exotic fruits, because even though this is a 400-year-old painting, at this time, this part of the world is starting to make contact with other parts of the world. And a big part of that contact and that exchange and that understanding is centered around nature and species and biodiversity. You have the guinea pigs over there. So either the person who commissioned this painting really liked guinea pigs, or, I mean, if anyone really knows guinea pigs, they get up to a lot of shenanigans. So I thought that's really both cute and interesting, because what are those guinea pigs doing? And you also have some birds. And up there is one of these is a scarlet macaw, a parrot, which most certainly was not perching in this, garden of the resurrection, if we're sort of literally interpreting it. So what you can also see is the artists here including elements of all these different parts of the world that are coming together. You have exotic birds like the scarlet macaw, the parrot. You have animals that are being introduced and becoming parts of people's daily life. You have plant species that are being traded across the world that are now, of course, to us, very obvious, but at that time, new and interesting, still interesting. So I think, especially given the sad events of this morning with the passing of Pope Francis, this is a very, I thought it was a fitting moment to look again at these beautiful paintings, to appreciate them, and to think, for hundreds of years, whether as artists or scientists, we've looked at nature, we've interacted with it, we can see the details. And I really want you to pay attention to the fact that we can see detail. It is something that is very, very human, and we have this remarkable ability to see detail and to recognize individual species, to tell them apart, and to start drawing many connections and much information from that. This is a sketch showing you a couple of things happening. But this gentleman here, I'm sure most of you recognize who that is. It's Darwin. And Darwin did many wonderful things. I just saw a wonderful poster of barnacles and the research around that by the students. And Darwin studied barnacles. And barnacles are really interesting and amazing. And he spent many, many years working on barnacles. So many years working on barnacles that his children used to tell their schoolmates that, when does your dad work on his barnacles? And because that was the dedication. He published a couple dozen books, and obviously we all know about him and Alfred Russel Wallace and the idea, the theory of evolution. But one of the things Darwin did is he looked at things in detail. And he looked at those details and he questioned them and he thought about them. And he saw in England, as the world was opening up and plants were being moved around, and there was a lot of desire and trade around some of these plants, especially things like orchids. So this orchid was collected in Madagascar, and it was taken to England, and it flowered in England, and it had this beautiful white star-shaped flower. In fact, they are called the Star of Bethlehem orchid, and this amazing long spur at the end of the back of the flower. This contains nectar. And so when Darwin looked at it, he immediately said there will be a pollinator, a moth, most likely, with a tongue that is attenuated, that is long enough to reach the nectar in that spur and to pollinate this orchid. Now, many people had looked at this, and actually, as often happens with good predictions, people said, no, that's ridiculous, there isn't going to be such an insect. And not surprisingly, a few decades later, that moth was found, Xanthopan morgani predicta, which names after Darwin's prediction. And you can see here's a specimen of the moth with the tongue unrolled. This here is a sunbird, and this is a giant lobelia, which are one of the endemic plants that grow in Kenya. Both these plants also grew where I grew up in Western Kenya, and I spent many, many happy hours watching them and studying them. In the case of the lobelia, it's a remarkable plant because they grow up at high altitude where they have to go through winter and summer every single day. At night it freezes, during the day it thaws out, and eventually after many, many years of growing, they send up this flowering spike that is several meters tall, and the sunbirds come along and they are the exclusive pollinator of this giant lobelia, just like the hawk moth is the exclusive pollinator of the orchid. So the two have evolved, they have co-evolved, they have traits that we can look at that are very reciprocal, but there's also, these many other elements of this relationship. So I was very lucky for my master's to work on hawk moths in orchids and other plants, and discovered that there were lots of different species of moths. There were hundreds of different species of plants that were being pollinated by these moths, and went out with a camera and was able to capture some amazing behavior. Things like, so the long-spurred orchids, these are two different orchid species here. And this is the fulvous hawk moth. And these spurs, what I discovered when I was dissecting them and doing measurements of the nectar and reading the sugar concentration, is that the concentrations at the top were close to 0% sugar. So it's almost just water. And at the bottom was like 20 or 30% sugar. Now, you would think with just sort of naturally with Brownian motion and everything else, that would be mixed up and you wouldn't have this gradient unless the plant was actually doing something to create this gradient, and that is what it was doing. My advisor didn't believe me at the time, and so I had to wait for him to come to the field with me, and we had to go out at night, and these plants only flower once a year if you're lucky, find the flowers, collect the flowers, dissect the flowers, measure the nectar, and as we did this, I could see the sort of lights going on in his eyes, and he's like, okay, Dino, this is actually really interesting. Because what the plant is doing is it's manipulating its pollinator. It is expensive for the plant to produce nectar. It costs the plant resources. So the ideal is to be pollinated without sacrificing too much of that resource. So in this case, it is a mutualism. It is a cooperation. Plants and pollinators are benefiting each other, but it is also, to some extent, a deceitful relationship. And then I went on to discover there were other plants that never produced nectar and tricked the moths. There were plants like this one here that actually drugged the moths, and they got high, and they then did all sorts of crazy things. And there was one plant here, another orchid, that these are actually the pollen, which are massive. They glue it onto the eyes of the moth. And so ultimately, the moth is blinded, and it ends up falling onto the ground. So it's not like everything is as rosy in this relationship. But it was also interesting to see that a few individual moths, species, provided the pollination to many hundreds of different plants. So another asymmetric relationship in nature that we wanted to learn about. So I was very happy studying hawk moths and flowers, but I do come from Western Kenya and from a rural community, and I wanted to understand, how could we connect the science that we did with the community and the landscape that I was part of. And one of the greatest joys and pleasures in my life has been working with traditional people, with indigenous communities, with farmers, with small-scale farmers, with subsistence farmers, with pastoralists in the field, where I'm approaching it not just as a scientist, but as part of that community, and trying to say, how can I bringing the thinking of science and they bringing this deep knowledge of the earth, the ability to see detail and understand it, how can we bring those two spheres of knowledge together? And how can we produce new knowledge and a new understanding that is deep and nuanced and impactful? So I've had this amazing privilege to work with them and to learn from them. I'm just going to introduce a few of them to you. This is Saleh, who is a member of the Rendile community in northern Kenya. They are camel keepers. They live in one of the harshest parts of northern Kenya, in the Chalbi Desert. And they're able to survive in a part of the landscape where even most other pastoralists are not able to, because of the incredible knowledge they have around camels, and also because the camels can actually go deep into the desert and can survive long periods of drought and continue producing milk. And the knowledge and the intimacy and the connection between the people and the camel is really tremendous. And I will come back to camels towards the end of the lecture. Here's Peter. Peter was one of my students, a master's student, and that we're actually on his family farm looking at mangoes. One of the great fun things about studying the things that you like to eat is that you get to go and enjoy the freshest and best quality fruit. So with mango, what we discovered, that's the mango in flower, is that it's largely pollinated by flies. And on Peter's farm, his father's farm, we found the mango trees had 1,000 different insect pollinator species. So we had flies, and we had ants, and we had stingless bees, and we had moths, and we even had mosquitoes playing a role in the pollination of mango. Because in the case of the mango, it's a very different relationship. It's a generalist. Many different species can provide the same services to the plant. Here is Domina. Domina is a farmer in far western Tanzania. This is the crop, the pigeon pea. It's a legume. So I worked very early on when I was starting out as a scientist with Domina and in that community. It's a very interesting part of Tanzania. For those of you who know the history of East Africa, there's been a lot of displacement of people. There are many refugees. Both Kenya and Tanzania have a policy of accepting refugees. And in the case of Tanzania, they actually go further and provide land and places for the refugees to live. So Domina is farming. She's farming in this very remote area to support her family, to feed herself and to earn a living. And the crop she's growing, the pigeon pea, is this amazing legume because it can grow in a very seasonal, very arid environment. You can eat the young leaves as a vegetable, you can eat the young pods, and then the pods ripen and you have the pigeon pea which comes out of it, which you can dry and store and will keep you going for a long time. It's a protein-rich food, which is in a landscape where there isn't a lot of protein available, but it's 100% dependent on the pollination by bees. And the lesson I learned from working on Domina's farm was that there are two groups of bees. There are carpenter bees, which nest in holes in walls and trees and things, and then also these leafcutter bees. So that's the carpenter bee, that's the leafcutter bee, that's another carpenter bee here. So fairly simple, what Domina was doing on her farm was creating a good, healthy landscape, not using any pesticides, but farming with a lot of natural area around the farm. And we discovered that a couple of these bees, especially these two, which were the most efficient pollinators, they didn't fly very long distances. They're quite shy and they like to stay close to where they nest. So because she had created this nice habitat, she had these incredibly good yields. So it was this connection between a landscape. These are wild insects, they're not domesticated, and somebody's farm. And it started, for me early on, realizing that there isn't, as in many places, this separation between people and nature that we see, especially in the West, that much of the world, actually, there's this deep overlap between people and nature, and there isn't a boundary, and what we do to one touches on so many other parts of the system. Here is Esther. Esther is a coffee farmer that I work with and still work with in Western Kenya. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Esther before we have a couple of other examples from other parts of the world. This is Esther's farm, and she grows coffee. Coffee facing some interesting tariffs at the moment. We'll see how that works out. And coffee is actually a crop that originally comes from East Africa. It is, by legend, domesticated in the highlands of Ethiopia, And in particular, East African and Kenyan coffee is known to be of great quality. This is coffee Arabica, which is the finest of the coffees. There are actually a dozen different coffee species that grow in the forests, wild, still grow today. And coffee is grown mainly by small-scale farmers, like Esther and her daughter here. Here's the coffee in flower. Coffee flowers once or twice a year, generally at the beginning of the rainy season. And when it flowers, it attracts lots of different insects, including bees. And it was thought that coffee wasn't really benefiting much from pollinators, but now there are lots of studies to show that, especially in these settings, yes, it does benefit from pollination. And the pollination affects not just the yield, but the quality. And that's all down to all kinds of cool things happening with pollen deposition and mate choice and genetics in the flower. But the coffee bushes are growing in a landscape that Esther is also looking after. And she's doing several things because she's one of those champion farmers that's amazing, producing amazing yields, a champion, an icon for her community, and a champion for biodiversity. So working with Esther, I learned several things. That the way she keeps the land around the coffee plants with a lot of grasses and wildflowers means that the bees and other insects that pollinate the coffee have things to feed on when the crop is not in flower. Given that the coffee only flowers for a short period of time, it needs to have pollinators that live longer and have to have resources that they can access at other periods of time. She's also a beekeeper. Here's a hive, and because it's a very wet area, she came up with this innovation of covering the beehives with a sheet of metal to keep them safe from the heavy rain, and she's keeping 2 different species of bees. We'll come to the species in a minute. Esther, like many farmers in Kenya, is older, and in many parts of the world, that knowledge of farmers is held with a generation who are kind of passing out of farming. In this case, it's a good thing that she has a next generation to hand it over to. But in working now with over 1 million farmers across Africa, just like in the US, farmers are aging. It's a demographic that is shifting. Many young people are not going into agriculture or seeing it as a livelihood. There is a lot of effort to change that in Kenya, but it is still something alarming because Kenya is a country that is dependent on its farmers to produce the food that sustains the country, as of course is the whole planet. So we're going to go to a few other places around the world and then back to East Africa. This is a beekeeper in Nepal. A few years ago, I was appointed to one of these UN multilateral environmental processes and was made a member of the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's kind of like the IPCC for biodiversity, and just worked with 77 scientists to produce the report. We produced the first big report. It's 800 pages. If you'd like it, I can send it to you for reading. But one of the things we did in this report that I insisted on, and a handful of us from the Global South, was that we would not just have Western science represented in this report, that we would include knowledge, folk knowledge, and traditional knowledge, and indigenous knowledge. And it's very easy to say that, but it's actually very hard to do it, especially when you're dealing with a very complex UN process that also has to be very scientifically grounded, because you have to take it in front of all the member countries after that to get them to agree to do something about it. So one of the great, amazing things was that we were able to go and visit some of these beekeepers and farmers. And this is in Nepal. And you'll notice that if any of you are a beekeeper, what would you notice in this picture? Who can see it? The queen, there she is. So it turns out in this part of Nepal, people keep not just the honeybees that we are familiar with, that are also here in North America, introduced to North America, but they also keep other species of honeybees, Apis cerana, in addition to Apis mellifera. There are a number of different honeybee species. There's another giant honeybee, Apis dorsata, which occurs on the mountains in the Himalayas, that migrates, and the people go and get the honey. But the remarkable thing was the level of grace and intimacy that the beekeeper had with his bees. And if anyone has kept bees, especially in certain parts of the world, you would know opening a beehive like this, pointing out the queen, and you can see he's not wearing any protective clothing. There were children, his family, dogs and chickens running around, and I was there with my camera flashing away, taking pictures. And what really struck me was the bees were so relaxed. They were not aggressive. They were so used to living in close association with people that over the many hundreds and thousands of years of people keeping bees, this incredibly peaceful relationship had come about, which you don't see in a lot of beekeeping, which tends to be a more aggressive form of beekeeping. In fact, a couple of the bee species they keep in their houses. And imagine just having in your kitchen or in your living room a beehive, and the bees are coming and going, and everybody's happy with that. Again, to us, that seems really unusual, but it speaks again to maybe this disassociation we have between nature and ourselves. Here are a couple more examples that came out of this time of doing this project and being able to go to different parts of the world. This is also another part of Tanzania. This is Mount Meru. And on Mount Meru are a group of beekeepers. You can see the hives are here, and she's got her hand on that hive, which again, for most beekeeping, you wouldn't do. But in this case, these are stingless bees. So she's holding the hive, which is right next to the wall of her house. And this is a women's group, an association of women beekeepers on Mount Meru that keep these stingless bees. Now, what are stingless bees? Well, stingless bees are a grouping of bees that are related to honeybees, but they're a distinct number of different species. And they occur in the tropical areas. They occur in Central America and in Africa, and in South America as well. So there is this amazing ancient knowledge out there about keeping stingless bees. So we know about the domestication of honeybees, which has been fairly well studied and well documented, and how people have migrated around the world with them. Remember, honeybees, again, were introduced to North America with European settlement, the same thing in Australia and many other parts of the world. But in these cases, these are native bees that have been part of that landscape for forever, and people have developed an association and a knowledge of them over many hundreds or thousands of years. So here is another part of the world. This is in the rainforest in Brazil, in the Amazon. And this gentleman is one of the people living in the forest, not far actually from the town of Belém, which is where the next COP, one of the big climate meetings, is happening. And you can see here a different species of stingless bee. He's actually cutting open a castanha do Brasil, a Brazil nut fruit that had fallen out of a big tree. And in this particular area, he lives in a community that are, a mixture of traditional and indigenous people and people who've settled in the forest. But one of the key things they do is using things like, the fruits of these wild trees, the Brazil nuts, keeping the stingless bees, and other activities. And if I was to say, one of the emerging lessons that has come from working with people in all these communities is that what makes it work? What makes it succeed? One is this intimate, deep knowledge of nature, but also that all of these systems are, that thing we're always striving for, sustainability and all these other buzzwords that we talk about, are kind of already inculcated into everyday life. And the other thing here, in all of these, the previous cases and this one as well, they're part of a community. They're individuals who are part of a community. The community has some stability over its resources, its natural resources, including biodiversity, but it's land and it's water. And that doesn't mean there aren't many outside forces which are affecting them. There are. And it's very, very tenuous, especially right now with globalization. But because of having that community and that knowledge, they're able to survive and to be part of a world in a way that we can all take a lesson and a leaf from this book. So here I am, trying to make the case for bees, and this is from the work that I actually did a lot of this work as my postdoc when I first came to Stony Brook. Dr. Leakey, who many of you knew, founded the Turkana Basin Institute, and he convinced me to come to Stony Brook and go to Turkana and not to stay and become a professor in America at the time. And I went up to Turkana with him and started looking and collecting bees. And I'd been collecting bees in Western Kenya, where I grew up near Kakamega Forest. So the remarkable thing is we started doing an inventory of the bees in Turkana is we discovered they were incredibly diverse. This desert environment had hundreds of different species of bees. And then the other remarkable thing was when I compared the two sites, Turkana and Western Kenya, which are not that far apart physically, a couple hundred miles, there was almost no overlap between the bee species. And only one species actually overlapped between the two sites. So now, after many years of work, we know there are about 250 species of bees in the rainforest, about 500 in the desert, and the only one in common between them is the honeybee, which is that one over there and that one over there. And so the bee that is kept and domesticated by people, but also in Africa, does occur wild. So one of the lessons that came out of this for me is that there's this incredible diversity. We know still so little about it. We've got to make sense of it, but we also have to understand those connections. And so now this led me to the next bit of work that I got involved in, which is thinking about deserts and savannas and rangeland ecosystems. So this is a scene in the South Turkwell Desert. Beautiful, it's rained a little bit, and here are some camels. I'm very fond of camels. You'll meet them again in a minute. And after the rain, the grass comes up very, very briefly, but the ground cover here is dominated by a legume called Indigofera spinosa, the bane of the field school students' existence when we do work in the field, because this, as the name suggests, it has these very long, thin spines, and they get stuck in your toes and in your shoes and scratch you. But to the camels, Indigofera spinosa is, it's manna sent from heaven. It's what allows animals to live in this incredibly harsh, very, very seasonal, very hot environment. And I worked on the Indigofera, and we went off and looked at all the different pollinators and discovered it was mainly bees, also a few butterflies. But what was remarkable is the plant is only in flower for a very short period of time, for maybe a few days a year, or maybe even every few years, because it only rains very erratically. But the animals graze on this plant year in, year out, every single day. And mostly what they're feeding on are its pods. And the pods are produced by the plant after it's been pollinated by bees, and there's like 50 different bee species that are pollinating it. What are the bees after? You can see the little bits of pollen here on their bodies, and that's what they're collecting to go and provision their own little nests. But because of this incredible interaction, you're able to support this livelihood that's part of this landscape in this very hot, very arid part of the world. So just to highlight, the Turkana Basin Institute is one of the institutes associated with Stony Brook University that is in Africa, and the other center is the Center Valbio in Madagascar. And so two real, very precious institutes that are associated with Stony Brook and offer a huge, tremendous resource for students and scientists to engage with big questions and deep questions and go out and make discoveries in the world. So we're going to now switch and talk about another group of things that I'm really interested in, and these are grasses. And I can already hear some of you moaning in the audience, like, what? Insects are one thing, but grasses, like the most boring thing in the world? Well, they aren't. And if you bear with me, I think I will convince you about this in a minute. So here is this incredible diversity of just a few. These are 100 species of East African grasses. And those are the spikelets, basically the seed, the reproductive unit, and those are the plants in flower. And there are between 12 and 14,000 grasses in the world, about 1,000 species in East Africa. And here is, of course, what we always think about when we think about Kenya and we think about East Africa. We think about the big animals. And I'm going to talk about the big animals and their connection with, obviously, one of the most overlooked aspects of biodiversity here. So you have the lion, the African lion. It's a species that's very interesting. Lions occurred across a much wider geography than they do today. Today, lions, which were found throughout Africa, parts of the Middle East, even parts of Southern Europe into Asia, only really occur in sub-Saharan Africa, and there is a small population of lions that occur in the Gir forest in India. The lion is this iconic, charismatic, animal that everybody coming to East Africa wants to see a lion. Whenever we have students and we go to the parks or we go to a conservancy, the thing they really want to see is a lion. And the millions of tourists who visit the continent, they want to see lions. Because there's just something about staring into the eyes of a lion that is, you can't replicate. It's a reminder of how sort of inadequate and small we are, and how many, for millions of years, they were sort of in charge and we were just had to be much more humble. But this lioness here, she's wearing a collar, I'll tell you about that in a minute. She's lying here in the shade and on a bed of grasses. And most people will look at this picture and they will see the lioness, but they will not really pay much attention to the other things that are in here. Now, of course, I look at the picture, and because we have this ability to see detail, I can tell you that there is Spirobolus pyramidalis, the drop seed grass. There's Pennisetum mesianum, one of the wire grasses. There's red oat grass, which is Themida triandra. There's Harpacne schimperi. There's Bothriocloin sculptor, the sweet pitted grass. I won't name all of them because we take a lot of time, but there literally are almost 100 species of grasses in this habitat. And without those, there would be no lions. Why is that? Well, because lions are essentially, like everything else on the savannah, made of grass, because they eat the animals that eat the plants. Lions today, it's estimated there's about 20,000 lions left in the wild in Africa. Of those, about 15,000 in Tanzania, about 2,500 in Kenya, sort of one population if you think about it. The lions move across those boundaries, and then the rest are scattered across the continent. That's not a lot of lions. If we went back just a couple of decades, we would find many, many more, thousands of lions. So the lions are an endangered species. And they're endangered for many different reasons. There's conflict between people and lions. There's the loss of the habitat. Lions are hunted in some places. Many, many different complicated things are interacting. But one of the most crucial things that underlies the success of the lions and their conservation is the habitat that they live in. And if that habitat is not healthy enough to support enough prey animals, you will not have lions persist. And so in order to keep this really magnificent animal that, as a Kenyan, I'm so proud of, if you look at the Kenyan emblem and flags, you will often see the lion depicted on it. We need to keep the habitat intact. In order to do that, we have to have a healthy grassland. In order to have a healthy grassland, you have to have hundreds of different species of grasses. Each of them have these amazing interactions that we're only just starting to understand. So the other big species that everybody knows about who's gone on safari in Kenya or Tanzania is the wildebeest. And the wildebeest famously migrate, across the Serengeti into the Mara, and about 1 million wildebeest are said to migrate. Actually, it's about 600,000 of them. There are about 1.2 million wildebeest currently, make the journey across the very dramatic, nature documentaries that you've seen. But the wildebeest is this quintessential grazer. They're an animal that takes, the most mouthfuls of grass a minute, more than cows. They are also very, very tied to the ecology of the savanna. A wildebeest weighs 250 kilos, and it needs, all of that nutrition and protein and muscle and calcium comes from, from the grassland. That you wouldn't, so, those of you who do maths quickly, think about that. 1.2 million wildebeest, 250 kilos, and all of this ecosystem. Clearly, there has to be a very powerful, very dynamic nutrient cycle that is involved in making sure species like the wildebeest can survive. Over just 130 years ago, wildebeest almost crashed because then there was another pathogen, rinderpest, a virus that also spread through Africa and killed off many of the animals. Rinderpest has since been eradicated, and today wildebeest numbers have been steadily climbing until just a few years ago, and they started falling off again. And the reason behind that appears to be some breakdown in this grassland ecosystem. So we're finding as we go to different habitats and look at the different grasses, some of the species are missing. They're just not there. That we know they exist, we know about them, but we can't find them. And this ecosystem has been very intensely monitored by scientists for almost 100 years now. So something's happening, we don't quite understand it, and we really need to figure it out if we're going to keep this spectacle of nature and this amazing migration of animals, and obviously also earn a lot of revenue from this. But one of the remarkable things about East Africa is that we still have the most spectacular wildlife. And in these areas in particular, we largely have it in areas that are shared land that is not just in national parks, but land that is also used for other purposes, that land that is owned by many different communities and different people. And around the Mara and Serengeti, one of those hopeful things that I've seen happening is more land being brought under the protection and the conservancy model, because that's a viable thing to do for those communities. And in these times in particular, where sort of selfishness and individualism is the order of the day, I think this offers a really interesting lesson. So in my beautiful country of Kenya, 8% of the land area is formally protected in national parks and reserves. Today, 12% of the land is in conservancies. This is one of the conservancies. I'm here teaching a field course about the grassland. And in this particular conservancy, this is Naibosho in the Mara, 800 different landowners, 800 families, have given up individual rights to that land to come together to form a conservancy that does several things. Now, first and foremost, it provides habitat for their cattle. Cattle are the lifeblood of this community, the Maasai, and they need space to graze the cattle, and the cattle are very important culturally and nutritionally and spiritually and every which way you can imagine. But the cattle are also really important ecologically, and they've been part of this landscape for thousands of years. But the remarkable thing is, because the individual families in this area where the land has been demarcated, it's been subdivided, they could decide to sell off parcels of land and get a lot of money, a quick cash payoff, but that would collapse this ecosystem. So by giving up individual rights, working in cooperation, setting up a system that has good governance and has a good sharing of resources, and of course, in this case, also earning revenue from tourism, this is allowing this, very remarkable, beautiful ecosystem to persist, but also allowing, people to continue some of the traditional lifestyle patterns that they've had, and to benefit, from those livestock and feel proud and feel ownership and feel included in conservation. The other species that is very interesting that I've been working with are the camels in northern Kenya, where we're now trying to see if, can we sort of take some of the lessons we've learned from this ecological system and apply it in a system that's much drier and much hotter and much more stressed and much more difficult? And the answer is yes, we are starting to see that some of those elements of what we can learn from one part of the savanna can apply even in another part of the savanna or even in the desert, and vice versa. I'll come back to why I'm kissing the camel in a little bit. But I do want to emphasize what has been absolutely wonderful has been going into these communities and going out with people who are very skeptical and are like, you're going to take us to look at grass, and I'm like, yes, we're going to go look at grass. And inevitably, a day or two later, people are filling their notebooks with pressing grasses, drawing them, asking me questions nonstop, and realizing that things that we've trampled on and things that we've ignored are actually what are keeping the whole system going. So here's another picture from northern Kenya, which I particularly love, because here is an example of a resource being shared that should make you hopeful. These are obviously elephants, and here are cattle, and I was actually in charge of managing and being strategic for this landscape for many years. And elephants are really interesting because they're one of those species. If we think about the African elephant today, there are about 450,000 elephants left. If we were to go back just 100 years, there were millions of elephants. So elephants are an endangered species. In Kenya, those of you who will be familiar with the history of Kenya, one of Dr. Leakey's early things was trying to stop the poaching of elephants. And when poaching hit its peak, our elephant numbers dropped to about 10,000, 11,000 elephants. And that's from hundreds of thousands of elephants. So you can imagine there was just this systematic killing of elephants for their ivory for decades, for actually several hundred years. So when it hit that point where if nothing had been done, elephants would have gone extinct. That's a longer story, but Dr. Leakey was appointed as the head of the Kenya Wildlife Service, which was a newly formed organization, and they went out to tackle the elephant poaching issue in ways that remain controversial, and we can talk about that separately at some point. But the key thing is that Kenya was able to turn around the trend on its elephant population. And today, the elephant population has more than tripled. There are 35,000 elephants in the country, and the goal is to continue increasing the number of elephants. Now, the challenge, of course, is in those decades since in 1989, when the KWS was formed mainly to stop poaching and protect elephants, the amount of land available to elephants is not increased. And everywhere, elephants are facing a lot of conflict with people and a lot of conflict over natural resources. But here's an example of these elephants are very relaxed, the cows are very relaxed, and they're both enjoying the water. And this is an example of a landscape where if things are done right, and there's enough intelligence and care, that compassion that goes into sharing these resources, that there's good governance around the distribution of those resources, that people of all different communities can find value, whether it's through livestock or through wildlife or through the entire ecosystem, then those ecosystems will flourish. And it's still very tenuous, but the fact that you can still take a picture like this, and for those of you who are students who come on the field school, we go and we watch scenes like this happen, there's something to be said about that. And what the scientists are discovering is that as cattle remove nutrients from the landscape, because as you harvest these are cattle raised for beef, they're obviously harvested, taken off. But as you're removing those nutrients, actually these guys, the elephants, are critical in putting the nutrients back into the landscape because of their ecosystem engineering, and obviously they eat a lot of food and they produce a lot of stuff at the other end. So here is another dramatic scene from northern Kenya. This is from a few years ago. It was actually the end of 2019. And this amazing thing happened that hadn't happened for decades. Swarms of locusts flew through the Horn of Africa. They came out of the Middle East, and this Indian Ocean dipole produced a cyclone, and the cyclone picked up the locusts, and these are desert locusts, and it blew them across into Africa. And on the 31st of December, they arrived in Kenya. And I was, of course, really excited by this. Everyone else was horrified and was like, what are we going to do? And there's a whole UN agency dedicated to locusts and managing them. Because locusts are one of these amazing species that in these incredibly dry environments, you add one ingredient, and that ingredient is water, and you flip it. You go from very low production and low density of living things to suddenly a saturation and very high density of living things. And the locust is perfectly engineered. It switches its lifestyle. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde arrangement. So the swarms appeared, and off I went. And of course, the first response from the agricultural sector and others is to spray the swarms. And we were trying to say, hey, maybe we need to look at this a bit differently. What was amazing was to see the locusts come and land here. They are feeding on some grass. This is the just maturing here. The yellow individual is the sexually mature individual. So at the time I thought, well, let's do some interesting science and let's try and do some community work around this. So we sequenced the genome of the desert locust with colleagues at the US Department of Agriculture and discovered the locust, this tiny insect, has a genome that is more than twice the size of the human genome. So that's another interesting thing we're looking at. But what I thought was very cool is that we were able in all of this time, and now also the pandemic is getting going, so the locust control people had an exemption from the lockdown and the curfew that the rest of us were under to go out, and what I said is, okay, well, we're going to try something different. So with one, I advised one of the community projects, and they started collecting the locusts and turning them into animal feed. Because if you raise livestock, one of the biggest challenges of feeding livestock is producing high quality protein, especially for fish or for poultry. So we did that, and you had to make sure these were swarms that hadn't been sprayed, and we discovered all sorts of other weird things happening, and Minister of Agriculture called me and threatened me on the phone, but we got it done. We proved that there was a different way of looking at what people see as a problem is actually a resource. And mostly, the animals, including my dog, the doo-doo bugs, doo-doo means insect, were very happy about the locusts and were eating them in large numbers, because that is actually what happens in these ecosystems. When the locusts appear, birds migrate and follow them. Every species you can imagine feeds on them, including people in some places. And so we proved that this could be done, and we also found that there was a way of biologically controlling them using a fungus that was not toxic to other species, because most of the chemicals used are very, very toxic. So a different way of thinking about this and a different way of approaching it. Here is another scene from the work on grasses. This is a community group in northern Kenya near Kinamba, and here they're harvesting grass seed. And this is a natural ecosystem, but this grass has been sort of encouraged. It's been semi-cultivated in that, it is a grass that's of high value in both the seeds as well as for hay and for fodder and a pasture. It's a women's group, they're managing this land. And this grass seed is actually worth money. So they're able to take the seed, collect it, put it together, and sell it. And you can also harvest the hay. And on 20 acres, in good conditions, in a very arid ecosystem that only gets a couple 100 millimeters of rain a year, but in good conditions when the rains did arrive, on 20 acres, we produced 4,000 bales of hay and several tons of seed. And that was a huge boost, obviously, for people's livelihoods and livestock. But also, when I walked through these fields, I would find the most remarkable insects and birds. No pesticides or fertilizers are used. It is a way of producing from nature without doing it in a damaging way. So just another lesson that has come out of that. So I'll be wrapping up in a few slides, but I just wanted to share a few other important lessons, especially since we do have students here today. So in doing the work on grasses, I've benefited as a scientist, as many of us have, standing on the shoulders of others. This is a very dear friend of mine, Anne Robertson, who's a botanist. She just turned 85. And Anne spent many years collecting plants and producing herbarium specimens and depositing them in collections. This is in Kew, the herbarium in London. And Anne collected this grass at Crackney racemosa in northern Kenya. And the remarkable thing is, then I've also collected a lot of grass specimens. I think Anne's up to almost 10,000, and I'm not far behind in sort of catching up the number of specimens. I know most of you won't care, but if you're collecting specimens, it's like, that's a big deal to get 10,000 specimens into a herbarium. As I'm going through the specimens, this is one of the specimens I find that Anne collected, and it turns out, even though there isn't that many decades between us, me is almost 50 now, but she collected for 40 years more than I have, I've never seen that grass in the wild. So where has it gone? It's part of the flora of northern Kenya, but it's disappeared. And so without that herbarium, without that resource that, so importantly scientific resources, we would never know. And today, if I hadn't gone, and I hadn't done this for 20 years to work on the grasses, I wouldn't know that in the Mara and in different parts of Kenya, about 20 to 40% of the grasses that are there are disappearing. So that has huge ramifications for hundreds of millions of people and livestock and production systems and, stability. And I think one of the important lessons to take from this is that, yes, this might just be collecting specimens, and herbaria are wonderful places to go and visit and learn from, but there's some really important lessons that we still have to get out of this. So I apologize, you have to look at a couple of slides of my books, but I bear with me. How do we address this huge gap and all these challenges in the world? Well, my approach has been coming from Western Kenya. I grew up with very little access to information about nature. I had tremendous access in terms of traditional knowledge and my own observations as a naturalist and my own drawings and things, but I didn't have a lot of access to scientific information. And there's been this huge gap. And I've realized in the world today, the science we're doing, including here at Stony Brook, around climate and nature, is some of the best science that's ever been done. The tools we have to deploy are some of the best tools we've ever had. The amount of data that goes into papers is the largest amount of data we've ever had, and the collaborations on those papers are amongst the broadest we've ever had in science. And that's wonderful. But the gap between that brilliant science and the public understanding and access to knowledge and the ability to take action is wider than it's ever been. I think we can all agree on that. And so how do we fill that gap? Well, this is my little way of trying to fill it. And to my absolute amazement, the Grasses book, which took me 20 years to do, I had to convince my publisher because they were like, really a book on grasses? Well, you've done a few books, so we'll go on this with you. And it sold out in 3 months. It's been reprinted. It's been reprinted again, actually, just the end of last year. And then other publications like this one on pollinators. As scientists, we write lots of papers. Mostly people don't read them, but in this case, a friend of mine took the book, because it's very much targeted at farmers and at practitioners, and put it onto a mobile phone, a cell phone platform in Kenya. And today, 1 million farmers a day access the information on pollinators. And I get questions on WhatsApp and on Facebook and in social media, and I can't keep up. We actually have an entire office that just deals with fielding the questions and responding to the farmers. It's translated into a number of local languages. And it's been one of those eye-opening moments for me as a scientist that we can produce knowledge and information, which we absolutely should, but we also have a responsibility, if we can, to take that knowledge or work with people who can take that knowledge and provide access to it and understanding to other people. So, sorry, yet another slide you have to deal with of mine. A few years ago, I'd written children's stories as a child, actually, because I was told stories. I grew up without television. We didn't have the internet. We certainly didn't have social media. I was in the forest a lot of the time. I had to just entertain myself after school. And stories were really important. And there's something about stories. People remember stories. You will all remember a story that you were told or a storybook that you particularly cherished. So what I've decided, I did during COVID, decided, okay, I'm going to go for this, despite even some scientists saying, really, Dino, do you want to be known as somebody who writes children's books? And the answer is, of course, it doesn't matter. And I did a couple of books. We've now got another, like, dozen books underway, and in the books there are several important lessons. One is that same attention to detail, to recognize different species of insects, of plants, of animals, and to know them, to understand them, to see them as beautiful and interesting and living things that are sentient and that we are connected with. But all of the stories are also centered around being curious and then solving a problem. Because one of the things that I feel we really need to have more of in the world is empathy. And there's no better way of building empathy than connecting with young people and getting them to see things and understand things. And so these are the first of two books that Penguin have done, and there'll be a couple dozen more that are hopefully in process. So the last couple of things I'm going to end with here is that what can we do, and I do want to say what is Stony Brook doing that is very tremendous, is getting people into the field. This is taken earlier this year, and I know some of the people in the audience will recognize themselves in the picture, and we're on the, the highest point of Central Island in the middle of Lake Turkana, which is like in the absolutely middle of nowhere. And these are the Simon STEM scholars on their TBI program that they came to the field in January. And we're very, very delighted that we were able, just out of a conversation, meeting Erwin, meeting a few of the other leadership. I think Kahindi and Alex are here as well. Thank you for coming and bringing the scholars to the field. And I can tell you it was very, very hard work at first, but every student left that landscape very touched and very moved and very connected and very aware that actually all of these big problems we face in the world, if you collaborate and you build community and you share information and you share knowledge and you do science differently, you can solve them. And so I really want to thank the program, the university, obviously the Simons and the faculty who all helped to sort of co-lead this experience. This was the first time we did it. We're going to do it again next year. And hopefully, just like the Origins Field School, some point somebody will stand up here, one of the students will stand up here and tell you, this is the 20th time that we're doing this in the future. So that's why it's so important that we sustain and grow these programs. Because I want to alarm you a little bit before you go off to have a reception and dinner. And people remember very gross, disgusting things much more than other information. Here we go. Why am I kissing a camel? Well, here I love animals. I think that's clear. And here, camels and rhinos are, sort of two of the most wonderful animals, domesticated animal and a wild animal. That is Mei Mei. Mei Mei's a rhino. I absolutely stole my heart and broke my heart. But I was interested in Mei Mei and in the camel here. This is Farouk, who's giving me a kiss. He's one of our biggest male camels. And this wonderful, so this baby camel, literally just a few hours old. You can still see the part of the umbilical cord. But they're all united by this very, very disgusting and wonderful and brilliant creature down here, the botfly. And this is Cephalopina. This is the botfly that actually lives, brace yourselves, in the camel's nostrils. And so the female botfly comes and she dances in front of the camels and she actually shoots her larvae and eggs out and they land and they wriggle into the nostrils and they, some develop in the nostrils, some in the pharynx. I mean, anyway, we won't go into the details too much, but eventually they hatch out and the camel sneezes. And at that moment, the sneeze is the most important time because then the larvae pop out and they fall on the ground and they quickly crawl into the mud and they pupate and then they start the whole thing all over again. As adult flies, they never feed. They don't even have mouths that can feed. So the entire feeding cycle of this remarkable creature is inside, the camel's nostrils. Now, on the rhino, we have a different botfly species, Gyrostigma, and they also do this kind of nostrils or lips, go into the mouth, into the tongue, into the stomach. But now, if you've gone into the stomach, you have to get out again. How exactly they do that, we're still trying to figure out. Either you come out the other end, or in this case, you actually, in some species, they drill a hole and they come out through the side of the animal. Now, you might say, okay, why did he end on this absolutely horrendous and disgusting note? Well, because yes, it is pretty gross, and there are botflies on humans, and I've had to remove them from students, which is quite something else. But as sort of challenging as this might be and make us all squirm, the biology underlying this, the microbial associations, the genetics, the behavior, the effect on the immune system is tremendous. And actually, it turns out, especially in the case of rhinos, having the parasites is a big predictor of their future health and well-being. And if animals as magnificent as the rhino and as beloved as the rhino go extinct, so do the animals that are associated with them, that are their parasites. And so watch this space, spring 2026, there's a big thing launching on that we've been working on parasites. So hopefully I'll get invited back then if we're still all around to speak about it. So thank you. I believe we have some time for questions. I believe we have a few minutes for questions if anyone isn't too horrified by the botfly.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I am wondering about the grasses that are disappearing. Are they being replaced by non-natives? And if so, what are they and where are they from?
Thank you. That's a great question. So interestingly enough, the African grasses have gone on to become invasive in many other parts of the world, including here in the United States. But so far, we're not seeing invasive grasses in Africa. None have been introduced that have managed to sort of break into the East African savanna ecosystem. They're disappearing, we think, due to climate change. But what does that actually mean? It means there's climate intersecting with many other things. Changes in how land is used, the application of fertilizers and pesticides, the movement of compounds that are toxins through the landscape that come from other human areas, industrial or urban. Different ways of managing livestock that are departing from the traditional way, which is a very mobile way that is very integrated with wildlife, to a much more industrial, commercial approach. So all of these things are intersecting. Historically, many pastoralists would set fire to parts of the savanna. That doesn't happen so much anymore. So, there's so many different ecologies underlying this, but also livelihoods, economics, politics, climate, everything. So underlying it is, all these questions, and we're still trying to figure it out. But it is of great alarm because, like many systems, if you pull out enough species, it's just more likely to reach a point of collapse than if it has all the species that, have been there for millions of years. Thank you.
A great talk, Dino. I'm fascinated by the very high diversity of small bees, of what I assume are mostly solitary bee species that you mentioned. And as you know, there's also very high diversity of such bees in the American deserts. Yes. And I'm curious about how do they manage to coexist? I mean, do they specialize at all on different flowers? Or, I mean, any sense of how that high diversity is maintained?
Thank you, Doug. That's a great question. And it is a puzzle. But the hot deserts of the world are diverse in bees. from South America to the US Southwest, the Mediterranean, to East Africa. Those are the hot spots of bee diversity. Bees seem to like it hot and dry. So several things seem to be going on. One is the patchiness. So even though there are so many bees, they don't all emerge regularly at the same time, because the flowering in this landscape and the availability of resources is very patchy. And just a few miles could be completely different. So that seems to be one of those things driving it, in that they're coexisting because there's a resource partitioning that's happening just by virtue of the harshness of this environment and the seasonality of it. The other part of this is there is a great diversity of plants. There are like over 10,000 plant species in this part of East Africa. Many of them are bee pollinated, and their flowering cycles are also somehow synchronized with these bees. But one of the real mysteries we're trying to solve is the diapause, because there are bees that I've collected only once in the 25 years now that I've been collecting bees in Turkana. And they've only appeared that one time in 25 years. So they have a very long diapause waiting for that moment where conditions will be just perfect for them to emerge and do what they do. And when they do that, they're only out and about for a few days, and then they disappear back into the ground. And almost all of them are solitary bees, as you noted, and almost all of them are ground nesting bees as well.
You took us on a great journey of your work over many, many years, doing many different types of research. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about how the Turkana Basin Institute enables that kind of work for yourself and for other scientists like yourself, whether that work is swabbing botflies from a camel's nose, or whether it's working with some of the community members that are there on sustainable practices, or such a huge diversity. So can you talk a little bit about that? And I was dedicated to ask a botfly question, so that's why I had worked that in there.
Thank you. So the Turkana Basin Institute is really one of those very amazing institutes that was founded by Dr. Richard Leakey, that is based here at Stony Brook, that together with Center Val Bio are these two incredible African research centers. They are field research centers with field infrastructure that welcome scientists and students from Stony Brook and around the world. There are about 200 scientists affiliated with the Turkana Basin Institute. There are field schools, so the field schools are one of the big things that we run. This year we have 14 field schools. We just concluded the Origins, which is the semester-long program that's run out of Stony Brook in partnership with the Department of Anthropology and other departments. We have a program in astronomy that's growing. But really what Dr. Leakey's vision was, that so much of the work that had historically been done in Africa had been two things. It had been very extractive, in that you collected fossils, or you collected specimens, or you collected knowledge, and you took it away from that landscape, and it was into the Western science infrastructure. And it was also very transactional, in that the relationship between those scientists and the landscape, or the people who are part of that landscape, was fairly fleeting. Establishing these institutes was to try to counter that, to make this relationship be deeper, to understand that all these resources, whether they be fossils or stone tools or botflies, come from a landscape that people are living in and have lived in for a very long period of time. And that if you did science where you actually connected and involved and co-produced that knowledge, the science would be better and more meaningful. Last week we had a talk by Amanda Lear, who was one of my postdocs at Princeton, who is now leading a big genome project in Turkana and making groundbreaking discoveries, but only able to do this because it's human genomes due to the relationship that is maintained with the community. And to be honest, right now these are very troubling times for science. I know that, and especially for these international relationships. But Stony Brook has a gift in this relationship, and I know the stewardship of them will continue and will last beyond this moment in time. But the key thing is to get more scientists and more students. So to build more research programs, and that, as director, one of the things I was charged with. So we are doing that, and we've started astronomy programs. We have more food security and sustainability programs, a little bit in energy and water, the Genome Project. So we're open to anybody coming, and last year we had a trip led by the provost along with faculty. We're trying to build new research areas from that visit, but all of you should come and visit Turkana at some point. It's part of Stony Brook.
Can you speak a little bit more on the integration of indigenous knowledge into scientific papers? I know you were talking specifically on the UN biodiversity study that you had done, but basically where it's successful and the methods and the actual way that that looks in a scientific paper.
Okay, so first of all, there are many ways of integrating knowledge, and we mustn't be arrogant and say only a scientific paper is the way of integrating knowledge. There may be many different ways of integrating knowledge. You and I may recognize a scientific paper, as does the university, as a research output from a process, and there are ways of doing that, and I'll talk to them in a minute, but there are many other ways of doing it as well. So science, at least as we know it, has been, or has it been, this largely Western exercise? Yes, for the last few hundred years. But curiosity and observation of the world and deep knowledge about it has been going on for thousands of years. And I would argue that we shouldn't draw the line. So the first step is you and I to not say there's Western science here and everybody else's knowledge over there, because that is just ridiculous. That is not how humanity works. And in our complex brains and our wonderful hearts, we can hold more than one idea at a time, and we can connect those ideas in nuanced and complex and messy ways. So the first thing is to break down that barrier within ourselves. The second thing is to make sure the way we do the science is dare I say it, inclusive, and is really involving ways that other people can contribute to the science as well. Because for those scientists I've worked with, and of course I'm working in a space which is a bit more applied, so it is easier to do that, the science has been much better, even if you measure it in terms of the Western scientific papers, books, publications, output. The other approach here is to say that we can go into the field, which many of our scientists do, and we can have conversations. And we can think around those conversations how we can bring other people's perspectives into what we do. And we can change what we do in the field. But it's very important when we do produce those papers that we provide the intellectual space for people to be part of it. And some of our research groups, there's some big research groups, have really gone into that. They're thinking about how can people who may not be the high-flying scientists, how can they have authorship on a paper? How can they be included? How can you acknowledge that the resources you're accessing are on their land and are part of their community? There is much indigenous science that is happening as well. That's also feeding into the Western science papers model. People are publishing. There are journals. There's a Journal of East Africa Natural History. I'm one of the editors. And it's been in existence for over 100 years. So there are definitely spaces to do this, but the real breakthrough to make the solution to your question is for individual scientists to start building those collaborations, but to be open to them. It's far from perfect. And the one thing I will say from having not just being Kenyan, but working in Turkana and in many countries, is there is no shortage of talent and brilliance in the world. What there is a shortage of are opportunities. And so again, often as scientists, we are all competing and fighting and struggling for opportunities, but we also have to remember that the privilege that comes with that opportunity, we have to also share that privilege and share that spotlight. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question for the bees, because since you were talking about how you're collecting them and they live in the warm environment.
Yep.
I just want to know for like maybe another 10 or 20 years, is there like another way to track the bees? And also, do you think their behavior will exhibit will change because of the climate change or like the weather or other like natural changing?
Thank you. So a really good question. How can we better study and understand these bees who are very difficult to find, but also how are they going to adapt and respond to this change that's happening in the world? Well, first of all, some of the spaces these bees live in get very hot. It regularly gets to 50 degrees Celsius. There are bees and insects and plants there, and people. There are sites that get to 60 degrees Celsius, and there are insects and plants there. There is a site in Turkana that gets to 73 degrees Celsius, and there are living things there. So they will adapt. There's been adaptations to heat in the past and drought, and we're only just starting to understand that. That is a potential hugely interesting area of research emerging. How will bees adapt? Well, they will. I'm hopeful they will. They've been through in this environment a lot of change. So if they can increase their diapause, the time they rest, and then change the time they emerge, if they have that pre-adaptation, that means they will be able to survive some of this. Maybe not all of them, but definitely some of them. But to come back to the first part of your question, which is a really important question, how do we study things better? Well, we get people like you to come into the field and look at things differently and bring a perspective from computer science or from mathematics or from photography or from art and say, hey, can we measure it this way, or can we look at it this way, or can we think about it this way? And then the scientist struggles and panics and is like, okay, well, maybe we can. And we try it and it fails, and we try it again and it fails, and we try it again and again and again. And ultimately, we do come up with a new way of looking and measuring. And that's how we do it. And we're not doing enough of that, and particularly in the field. Ecologists now, just reading today, there was an article saying ecologists are spending less time in the field than ever before. And I'm like, well, it should exactly be the opposite. We should all be spending more time in the field to engage with that question. Thank you. There's a question down here.
Hi, thank you for that talk. It was really interesting. You mentioned the relationship between people in Kenya or the global south with their environments, the plants, the animals. Do you think that this type of relationship is compatible with the way we live in the West or in the US? And if not, which probably not, how do you think we can begin to shift our lifestyles to be more sustainable or inclusive of nature?
Okay, well, thank you. That's a very important question and a very difficult question. Is the lifestyle compatible? I'm afraid the answer is no. But, and I think the but is important, there are many different ways people are doing things in many different countries. When I go to the Amazon, yes, you see a lot of destruction and you see a lot of problems, but remember, even today, with all the negative stories around the Amazon, most of the Amazon rainforest is still intact. Large areas that were deforested are regrowing in our secondary forest. There are many communities that live there, that have lived there for a long time, and they're utilizing that landscape in all kinds of messy, creative ways. When you go into Africa, you find many people doing that. What is really challenging is that where those systems are working, whether it's the harvesting of Brazil nuts, or it's the keeping of livestock in the conservancy, or it's the milking of the camels, is the external forces that are coming in and that are disrupting and destabilizing them. So one of the big things we have an impact on is consumption. And how we consume ends up having massive ramifications for hundreds of millions of people in other parts of the world. And whether you're consuming, legitimate or illegitimate, or, tariff or non-tariff goods or whatever it is, as a consumer, that's a lot of power. And so we need to understand that. That's one important thing. But the other thing is we can empower, even within a country like Kenya, we can say, if I'm going to buy beef, I will buy beef from the conservancy and the community that are trying to produce it in a more responsible way. I will go to the farmer's market, which we do here as well. I will go to the beekeeper. I will get back in touch with the people that are producing the food that I'm eating and try to connect and be responsible about that. So I think there are many steps we can take as individuals, but the more important steps are to understand that there are some dynamics here that are somewhat outside our control, but what we do have a responsibility to and elect good leaders, and that will make a massive difference in the world. And overall, the trajectory we're moving in, I am hopeful, because as I said, I spend a lot of time with young people, because I can see their passion and their willingness not to see the differences between people, but to work together, not to allow petty things to get in the way of collaboration. And that is, that for me is really the way we'll solve this problem. But it's a very important question, and in this case, there are no easy answers to it. Thank you. Perhaps on that very thoughtful question, we should close.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture, Dr. Martins.
Thank you. Thank you very much.